Yes, the classical bit is important in the title because that's the world I'll be talking about, and then briefly at the end showing the derivations from that, which will go into more detail in the 17th century in June. The talk covers the 800 years before Christ, and the Greek episode roughly is the mythic period, the pre-Socratic. That word is falling out of favour now, and people are not quite agreed on what term to use instead of that because nobody knew that they were before Socrates. The Golden Period, where Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, who taught Alexander the Great, who went on a great empire extending military campaign to create the Hellenistic period and spread Greeks over all of the Eastern Mediterranean region, which is why Paul, a Jew, could write to the new church in Rome, the home of the Latin Roman Empire, in Greek.
So all these numbers at the top, they're years BC?
They're the hundreds of years before Christ.
Not the time of day.
No. To put you in the picture a bit of what else was going on there, the Assyrian Empire was around here, and they, from my last talk, wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. Then the Babylonian kingdom arose, which took out into exile the southern half of Israel. The kingdom of Persia arose, and King Darius sent a few of the Jews back to rebuild the temple, which is about the same time that the Buddha and Confucius were alive. Then came the Hellenic period and the Roman period, and here around 200 BC, the Ptolemies took over Egypt. So we'll start back in that mythic period with Homer writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hesiod, the Theogony and Works and Days. And this is their founding mythology about the gods, and these gods were not very nice people. In Homer's book, they were jealous, warring, fighting, licentious. Hesiod's gods were a little interested in human justice, but not much more than interested. Come in there. I'm covering the 800 years before Jesus walked the earth here. The Greek history is split up into the mythic, pre-Socratic, Golden, Hellenic and Roman times, and I've just given a bit about the other things that were going along there with the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenic and Roman empires. And we're back into the mythic period with Homer writing the Iliad and Odyssey and Hesiod his Theogony, which were the founding myths of the Greek world. The next group arose were the Milesians in Miletus, which was a wealthy cultural centre. It had 3 harbours and was the centre of trade in the Black Sea and all around the Eastern Mediterranean. And the first naturalists arose there who sought natural explanations for phenomena such as storms, lightning and everything else instead of blaming the gods for it. Their belief was that the basic stuff of nature is sufficiently active and refined to account for all phenomena, including life, consciousness and thought. But when you read their stuff such as Thales, the first of these people, it's always hard to tell where the gods end and the natural processes take over. They never separated them like we might. Thales predicted the solar eclipse of 585, which made him famous, and he argued that the universe is made of water because he could see it in its liquid, solid, gaseous phases and thought that the rest was made from that. We think it's all made from hydrogen, so we're still there. Anaximander was another of the Milesians who thought for natural explanations for things, and he thought that the universe was governed by laws and that number is the ruler of forms and ideas and the cause of gods and demons. And he wanted, he with this bit, he wanted to subject the gods of Homer and Hesiod to the normal laws of the universe. They weren't allowed to rampage outside the laws that operate here. He thought of the spontaneous generation of life from slime or mud, that the first forms of life were like fish, which adapted to dry land, that human life began as fetuses in fish, and he had a flat earth and a small universe. The third of the Milesians was Anaximander, who thought that the basic stuff is air, which is divine. And again, there's no clear differentiation between what the gods are and what nature is in their writings. He thought that motion and the universe were eternal and that motion produces changes. And he differed from the later atomists that you'll hear about in that he thought the qualitative differences can be reduced to the quantitative factors of matter, but that the basic units of matter have qualities, which the later atomists denied. And he also believed in a flat earth. Then came Pythagoras and the Eleatics, and these are put together because they attacked materialist explanations of the world.
What are they called, Eleatics?
They came from that region of Elia, like the Milesians came from Miletus.
And that's an island on the Mediterranean.
I can't remember if it's an island or one of the towns there.
No, it's on the coast of Turkey.
Yeah.
And where's Elia?
No, haven't got my map with me, I'm sorry. But they're all in that region around there, but not necessarily in Greece. There was a surprising amount of travel by ship in those days. And people moved rather more than what I expected in their lifetimes. They could move across the seas several times. Pythagoras was a religious leader and taught self-discipline. He said we're answerable to the gods, but he believed in souls being migratory. So none of his followers were allowed to eat beans because they looked like they were the shape of a fetus. And he was very famous for his self-discipline. The aristocrats sent their children along to be educated by him. They didn't want anything to do with the religious part of it all, but he provided a very good, rigorous education for them, just like church schools today. But he did a bit of study on music and the relationship of string length and pitch and became the founder of mathematical physics. But you have to be careful with the idea of maths and numbers in these days because they had a basic belief in numerology where numbers had magic and powers. And the big magic powers for the Pythagoreans were 4 and 10. And when you put 10 items in a triangle structure, that was so famous and holy that they swore by that rather than by a Bible or anything else, the Tetrictus. The Eleatics, the first of them was Xenophanes, who studied fossils in various places and came to the conclusion that these were prehistoric animals that had become trapped in mud and it had all hardened into rock. And he used this to develop the concept of a cyclical history of the earth. He thought that the world has an intelligent divine order, but he ridiculed the gods of Homer and Hesiod because they were anthropomorphisms, and he wanted to subject the gods to the morality that he knew.
Just anthropomorphism?
We project our own ideas onto a super being and we call it God.
It's man's idea of what God is.
Yeah, well, they're just the human's projection onto these mythical gods of what they thought they might be like. But he did think that there was one mighty God who was super intelligent, that humans have mere belief and that the gods have knowledge. But along the way he wanted natural explanations for some things, such as the formation of clouds from the sea. Parmenides was an interesting one who said that nothing comes from nothing, which in all the debates that will come up later on about creationism versus its critics in Antiquity, this statement shut out the Old Testament concept of God creating from nothing, which shut out a lot of the opportunity for disagreeing with the atheists of that time. He also said that there cannot be a nothing, a vacuum, which was, and therefore there can be no real change, no empty space for things to move into. And Aristotle took this up and agreed with it that a vacuum can't exist. And this was still a problem in the 17th century with Descartes' physics, because his stuff all had to push, because there was no vacuum for anything to move around, and you couldn't have forces operating across a vacuum. This was the big break with Newton's physics in the 17th century. Change is therefore an illusion. Now, whether he meant this or whether we don't know. But this was a problem for later on. The next of the group was Zeno, who produced paradoxes arguing that matter, space and time cannot be infinitely divisible. And he had several paradoxes. I've put two up here. One is the flying arrow, that it's flying, but if you take minute units of time, it's not moving in those times. So it's actually not moving at all when you add all the bits of time together. And he did the same thing, that going from A to B is impossible because you've got to go halfway, and then you've got to transverse half of the remaining distance, and then half of that, and then half of that, and because it's all infinitely divisible, you'll never get there. So the problems left by these Eleatics were this infinite divisibility of matter, space and time, and the problems of change versus continuity. We see change in trees and humans and in our own selves, but what's change and what is continuous? The next group to arise, and you start to see that there's a colour pattern here, because no one seems to have plotted what I'm going to suggest tonight, that there was actually a sort of intergenerational oscillation between emphasis on the gods and emphasis on natural explanations. And the greens are the ones who emphasise the gods, and the blue will be the ones who emphasise natural explanations for everything without the gods. And there's a change in tone of them with this group of the atomists. Very clever. They decided that matter is composed of atoms, which avoids the infinite divisibility problem left by Zeno. But to get where he wanted to, Democritus then had to postulate an infinite number of and variety of atoms in infinite space in infinite time. So he didn't get rid of the infinite at all. But the atoms was a loaded philosophical term. It was atom, uncuttable in Greek. And by this Democritus word atom, Democritus meant that it's uncuttable, therefore these minute structures that make up everything are indestructible, therefore they are eternal, therefore they were never created, therefore no gods were involved in the creation of the universe. And when this atomic structure was revived in the 17th century, this provided a few problems with the physics of this. And Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton changed the word to corpuscles and corpuscularianism to get rid of that atheist taint of atom. There were atoms which bounced around in a void, a vacuum, which allowed movement and change. So they had a dualism of atoms and void, and that was it, nothing else. All the atoms were different, but they're all so minute, they all could bang together, all falling through free space and accidentally joining and doing things, and there was nothing else to account for anything. So they had infinite eternal atoms, eternal motion, infinite space and time, chance, no design, no purpose, no value, no meaning. And with infinite space and infinite atoms and infinite time, you can have many worlds, which Democritus postulated. But with no meaning to anything of it, he said, well, there's no meaningful activity that you can get involved with, so don't get involved with politics and fighting and everything else, just have a quiet time, be cheerful. He was known as the laughing philosopher because he thought everything was so meaningless, you might as well just laugh. They were determinists because everything is mechanical, and he argued that there's no afterlife of punishment to worry about, and he also was a flat earther. The gods are not interested in anything of us. They're not involved in creation, they're not involved in our life, there's no afterlife. Forget about them and just be cheerful. In reaction to this came the golden period of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And it does appear that their philosophy is very teleological for Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And it does appear that they were driven by the meaninglessness, valuelessness, purposelessness of the previous generation of atheists. They were effectively atheists in our terminology. Socrates, it seems, only knew Leucippus, who's a shadowy figure that not much is known about, but Plato and Aristotle were clearly reacting to both of those atomists and emphasising telos, purpose, but not necessarily theists. Socrates was very much a creationist in bits that are written about him, and he seems to have been reacting to Leucippus because it doesn't seem that Democritus, it's all a bit hazy for times, but Democritus doesn't seem to have been alive and saying anything much when Socrates was around, but Leucippus had stirred the pot. He was put to death because he didn't believe in the gods of the city and was introducing the youth to foreign gods. So the Greek cities did take the gods seriously. Then came Plato, who looked for what was eternal, unchanging, beautiful and good. And part of his movement was anti-Parmenides, with the idea of you can't move anything. Well, he said, yes, this world is a world of conflicting emotions, drives, temptations, and decay. It's a world of becoming. Whereas the ideal world is ideal, perfect, the forms of permanence where things are a being. And the easiest way to think about that is to think of my uncle driving me through Sydney about 10 years ago and all the cranes in the building and their roadworks and everything else. And he said, look, Sydney will be a wonderful place when they finish it. But of course, Sydney will never be finished because they keep on doing that. It's a place of becoming. Whereas Adelaide, nothing happens, nothing changes. It's a place of being. He thought the soul is the real person, and he had an active dualism which impressed people when his works were revived in the Renaissance. But it wasn't a Christian concept of soul at all. And he was anti-democracy.
Explain what dualism actually means.
Dualism, well, we're a body and a soul, and the two somehow or other interact to make the whole person. And this bobs up and down all the way through Western history, revived in significant form with Descartes, amongst others. He was anti-Democritus, and he argued that the universe is teleological, that it is a matter of order imposed on chaos. God didn't make the universe, but he fashioned the universe out of pre-existing material and made the order that we have. In the Timaeus is his biggest work about creationism, and in that he also played around with atoms a bit. And the interesting bit is that in his book on laws, chapter 10, he said that society can't trust atheists. The atheists want to vaguely suggest that it was some religious nutter who said you can't trust atheists. It was actually Plato who said this. And in that chapter 10, he says, well, the society puts up with atheists until they do something wrong because they're not answerable to anybody, and then you dispose of them, quite cruelly. So he was the first person to make a belief into a crime. Interesting event there. Then came Aristotle, who again emphasised teleology, but he wasn't a theist. The universe always existed. He thought we got real knowledge through our senses, so he set about studying the real world and developed logic. He was anti-Parmenides in developing these concepts of actuality and potentiality, and when you look at it, it looks like a word game. Seeds and fetuses and conceptuses and such all have the potentiality in there, and somehow or other everything that they're going in to grow into is tiny down in there in them already. to try and get change and continuity at the same time. He was anti-Democritus in that he was very teleological. God and nature make nothing without ends or purposes. He had his four famous causes: material, efficient, formal and final, and the final is the teleological, why you might make anything. The material is the stuff, the timber you make it out of. The efficient cause is the tools you use to turn the timber into a chair. The formal is the process of doing all of that, and the final thing is that you want a chair that you sit on. So these were the four causes that he made. And he talked about God being an unmoved mover who was unmoved by anything else. But it's hard to see that he thought God actually did anything or made anything. You see the alternation then coming in between the God's nature, God's and purpose. But after Aristotle, four new schools of famous Greek philosophy blew out. The Cynics rejected civilization, maternity, material goods, education, just like the modernists throughout history. Rousseau's noble savages, we have the anti-vax people, anti-science, anti-everything going on now. They've always been, this primitivist streak has always been there. The Cynics said, live according to nature, though they ran around naked, had public sex and excreting, which is why they were called dogs, which is the Greek meaning cynic. The skeptics said that you can't, arose here. There were two breeds of skeptics. There were the Platonic school of skeptics at that stage, but most of it is based in Pyrrho, who said you can't be certain about anything, thus you can't be dogmatic about anything, and you can't be dogmatic about nothing. So you can't be an atheist because you're being dogmatic about nothing being there. And this is important in the 18th century because David Hume was a very balanced skeptic. Everyone remembers that he said, in religion you can't prove anything. But he also said that in science you can't prove anything. And you look at his life and his reaction with the others, and he also was not an atheist because he, like these original skeptics, said, you're being dogmatic. You can't prove it. Nor can anyone else prove anything. Then came Epicurus. And this is the big line that we'll be following tonight, who put up this interesting four-step argument, which is a real conundrum for any theist. Well, how come we've got evil if you say there's a God? Either God wants to prevent evil and can't do it, in other words, he's impotent, or he can do it and he doesn't want to. He has a malice which we cannot attribute to him. Or he neither wishes to nor can do it. He's both impotent and evil, and therefore he's not God. Or he wishes to and can do it, well then why come evil? Why doesn't he prevent it? And this argument has been revived in the last month. I mean, it's been around all along, but the most public one in the last month or so was Stephen Fry, with his argument about children with bone cancer. How can God let this happen? And the sum of his argument was that Epicurus said, well, the gods are not interested in us, they have nothing to do with us. He was a materialist. He didn't deny the gods, and that wording is clever because he didn't say that they don't exist. Well, they do exist, but he gave them nothing to do at all with creation, in life or afterlife. So he didn't deny the gods, but he was very strongly anti-religious. He said there are no creation, there's atoms in the void. He believed in a materialism, mechanism, immutable and eternal physical laws, but he didn't want the determinism of Democritus, so invented this thing called a swerve, where in falling through space the atoms just randomly swerved, a sort of primitive quantum effect, which gives free will. Well, it doesn't give free will, it gives something like random thoughts, but anyway, that's what he proposed for it. He thought that matter, space and time are quantised to get around Zeno's paradoxes, And he proposed a naturalist evolution of beings and cultures, and also proposed many worlds because you've got infinite time, infinite space, infinite atoms like Democritus. He thought that since perception is accurate and the sun, moon and stars are exactly the size, shape and colour that they appear, he believed in a flat earth, but he used his logic and reason to say that logic and reason are unreliable and you shouldn't have too much science or reason because they'll bother your equanimity. Just have a quiet, happy life. What you should have is the pleasure, go for pleasure and avoid pain. But his was the pleasure of moderation. Don't go to excess with booze or food because you'll get into trouble. You won't be happy and comfortable then, and avoid pain. And he set about vigorously to relieve fear in his vigorous anti-religious elements. Remove fear of the gods, they're not interested in us. Remove fear of death, it's a nothing. All the matter and things that you're made of just stops, and after you're dead, it's a nothingness like the nothingness before you were born. And of judgment, well, there's no judgment because there's no afterlife. Your soul, your mind is just very fine atoms that go through the body and they disintegrate like the rest of your body. So there's nothing there for any revival afterwards. And many people use this sort of argument, Philip Adams amongst them. He set up an ascetic, caring communal society which included women and slaves. But it didn't last long with the women and slaves just being there for philosophical education. In the garden, which I found recently lasted for several hundred years. He was quite an influential fellow through the Roman Empire. There were various hostile reactions to him to both the metaphysics and to the moral thing. And what I found is that the current Epicurean atheists don't want to admit how much Epicureanism changed into libertinism, hedonism within 100 years or so. And this is the big problem for that world. Yeah, you can go and do what you like, run berserk, enjoy everything to excess, and just look after yourself. And this is the big problem for the atheist worldview built out of materialism, because Epicurus said that this means you ought to have a quiet, caring life. But as David Hume pointed out in the 18th century, you can't get an ought from an is. Just because this is the way the world is, cannot tell you how to behave or how we ought to behave. So you get Epicurus proposing that we all ought to be nice and quiet and gentle with each other. These who went berserk, sex and food and booze and everything else, berserk, live, eat, drink and be merry for tomorrow we die. And in the French Revolution, when the atheists took over, they invented a very effective beheading machine, turned on head choppings as public entertainment and chopped off up to 5,000 heads a day, making ISIS look like raw amateurs. So out of this materialist atheist universe, there's nothing about it that says how you ought to behave. You can be quiet, you can be libertine, berserk, hedonist, or you can be murderous. As David Hume says, the material scientific view doesn't tell you anything about how you ought. Notable critic, what surprised me was that Galton, the Roman physician, wrote about 14 treatises against the Epicurean atheism. And the early church fathers later on got into the act too. Sextus Empiricus was the one who revived scepticism. And around the same time rose the Stoics, who they were interested in changing the way people lived. They were not interested in big-time philosophical argument and all the rest of it. Live according to human nature, which meant reason. Virtue is the only good, and for happiness, avoid both pain and pleasure. And this is where we get the word stoical. You don't even go for the Epicurean pleasure bit. You avoid everything so that you just stay on an even plane and let nothing ruffle you. well, your friend's wife dying, that doesn't ruffle you because it's not personal for you, and so you should be the same when your own wife dies. Just don't let anything disturb you at all. And he ran the highest conventional Roman moral values. This is another Zeno who founded Stoicism. I haven't put his name up because of the confusion there. But the Stoics believed in a pantheism, that the universe is God, God is the universe. So there is providence, nature has a rational and moral, deep structure. And they said that God or Zeus or fate or reason and all gets a bit mixed together there. Inheres in matter. It's the active principle in matter, it's the divine logos. The reason, the wording that makes everything move is God in there. Now, with all of this, you won't be surprised to find that there was an active debate of creationism and its critics. And I give it that title because there's a book came out in 2007 entitled Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity by a fellow named Sedley, a classic scholar. And if you have any interest in the current creation chance debates, get that book and read it, because it is a marvellous summary of all of these features, and it shows you that there is nothing new in the debate at all, not even the mood that it's sometimes conducted in. It was all going on way back then. The atomists really stirred it up. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle reacted to it. Epicurus and Stoics got in there and got involved. But out of this debate, the Stoics and the Epicureans came to dislike each other, even hate each other. They had what you might call very vigorous debates for hundreds of years over all of this stuff. And it went on for hundreds of years. And about 200 AD, the early Christian apologists joined in the debate on the side of the Stoics, but they had more to say about things than just the Stoics. About this time, about 240 BC, Eratosthenes, the chief librarian in Alexandria, measured the diameter of the Earth. Very interesting, because he left us his method, his measurements, the calculations and the results, and he got it better than 5%. The only reason he was out by that much was that he didn't realise, as Newton later worked out, that the Earth is actually flattened at the poles and wider at the equator. He wasn't the first. Aristotle has a measurement for the size of the Earth, but he's about 20% small and doesn't tell us how he got it or where he got it from. The next group of antagonists in this story are Cicero, a Stoic, and Lucretius, an Epicurean. Lucretius was a passionate Epicurean. He wrote De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the universe, in Latin, and it's regarded as the best philosophical poem ever, but it wasn't the best Latin poem ever. He provided a completely natural, no supernatural event at all, explanation of the physical origin, the structure, the operation, and the destiny of the universe and people. Atoms was a Greek word, so Lucretius did not use that in his Latin discourse. He used equivalent words, and the void, the vacuum. That's all there is, and everything is made out of that. He also talked about the emergence and evolution of life forms and also of society. Like his forerunner Epicurus, he was in love with the natural and rural world, not the city. And when you think he was in and around Rome and all the murders and fights and everything that were going on in Rome, it's easy to see why you'd go for the bush. And he was intensely anti-religious also, and wanted to enlighten and liberate from fears of the gods, the fear of death, the fear of judgment, and has a very long poem which he spells out and argues this very well. In Book 1, line 1052, he argues for a flat earth and ridicules the idea of the Antipodes. And it's interesting that with the invention in the late 19th century of the idea of a war between science and religion, and the Christians were so backward they believed in a flat earth, that came about because Latron twisted the words of about 5 early church fathers to make it look like they thought the earth was flat. But here are Democritus, Epicurus and Lucretius, the founders of modern atheism, who straight out believed in a flat earth. And not too much science or reason or anything. Sorry?
And what's that word Antipodes mean?
The Antipodes, the other side of the globe. How can there be anyone on the other side? This is what he rubbishes. How can there be anyone in the Antipodes, on the other side of the globe, who's walking around in sunlight while I'm asleep at night? Completely ridiculous. Can't have that. Cicero was born before and lived after Lucretius, now both in and around Rome. He was first taught by an Epicurean philosopher, then he played around with the Platonic system in its sceptical phase, then he became a Stoic, and he wrote De Natura Deorum. He developed a fierce hatred of the atheist view of the world of Epicurus, Lucretius and such. And he pitted the Epicureans as defenders of mechanistic materialism and inactive gods against us Stoics, who are defenders of teleology and providential gods. And he was such a great thinker and writer that he forced the development of Latin for philosophy. Latin had been a very good language for military work, for bureaucracy, and for legal work, but it was hopeless for philosophy or theology. And he forced the development of Latin for philosophy with his work here in about 50 BC. Unfortunately, Latin never became a good language for theology, which is one of the problems of the Western Church. But his writings are so marvellous and such wonderful Latin, and his expressions and his whole pattern of arguing is so good that he had an enormous influence on Western Christian writing style and theology right through and after the Renaissance. An odd little group in this lot are the Sadducees, who provided at the time of Jesus and for some time before virtually all of the high priests in Jerusalem for the Jews. And the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were so sad, you see. And they thought, well, God acted there in creation, and God acted there in, not the exile, the liberation from Egypt, but he doesn't do anything now. And when we die, that's it. There's no resurrection, we just die. There's nothing afterwards. And you think, well, what did they think they were doing with their big ceremonials, being high priest and all the rest of it? And then they seem to have been very much like the deistic critical liberal theologians now, where you think, well, what do they think they're actually doing in their religious services? In New Testament times, the Epicureans and the Stoics are the only classical schools of philosophy that get a mention in Acts. And in those times, Nero, we know about his killing of the Christians, but he killed anybody that got in the way. Jews, Christians, Stoics. He even killed his own Stoic teacher, Cicero. And this was because at that time, the Stoics were functioning as the conscience of the Roman Empire, and Nero wasn't going to have that. So he got rid of them. Amongst the early church fathers, there's a list of those who considered the concept of atoms. They commented on it and none of them rejected it because they very clearly saw that you could separate the physics from the metaphysics. Matter, space, time all came into being with the creation. So you can have the physics that these atomists have talked about, but you don't have to have anything to do with their philosophy at all. And so they emphasised intelligence, design and providence of God in creation and the operation of the universe. If you're interested in the creation debates going on, Origen is one of the best ones to read with his comments on the creation debate back then. In medieval times, various people have commented on the Epicurean line of thinking through the Middle Ages, but not much was known outside of very small circles. And William of Conches is one I picked out, who separated the physics from the metaphysics again and said, yes, the atoms came into being with creation. It looks like a good way to explain the operation of the universe, but we don't have to take all of that with it. Then the big event of 1417. Poggio Bracciolini, a papal secretary, was famous for searching through monastery libraries and finding ancient works of importance. And in 1417, in a monastery library in southern Germany, probably Fulda, he discovered 2 copies of Lucretius's poem, De Rerum Natura, and it was in Latin, which now was the language of education of Europe. So he copied them. His writing is beautiful. I mean, he was apparently a very fast writer, and I've seen photos of some of his work, and it is beautifully neat writing for somebody who is famous for speed and accuracy. By 1500, we know of at least 80 hand copies of this manuscript, but there were 4 editions of this Latin atheist poem rolling off the newfangled printing press. So this atheist poem was spreading its message through all of the educated classes of Europe for 100 years before and all through the Reformation. And that is what changed the world from there on. The 17th century, these are people that were all affected by it. You'll need to come back for the sequel when I talk about the 17th century, where I argue that there was a metaphysical revolution, not a scientific revolution, a change in the metaphysical framework within which science was done and measured. Galileo played around with the idea of atoms, which got him into trouble with the Inquisition, who looked at it and rejected it. Said, no problem there. Francis Bacon, setting up the scientific method, was a devout believer in Democritus, the first atheist Epicurean philosopher. And everything that Francis Bacon takes from Epicurus and Lucretius, he attributes back to Democritus, which has confused a few scholars. The important one in the 17th century is Gassendi, a French Roman Catholic priest, who in 1624 launched a frontal attack on Aristotelian scholasticism. When that didn't work, he adapted Epicurean atomism to Christianity as a weapon against Aristotelian physics. That work by Gassendi was translated into English by Walter Charlton, and that translation affected everybody who was anybody in the new Royal Society. As I said, Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton changed the word atoms to corpuscles, but Locke, Leeuwenhoek, Huygens, everybody in the Royal Society was affected by this translation by Walter Charlton of Gassendi's adaptation of atoms and Christianity, Epicurean atoms. You see this in the literati. Thomas More back in 1500, Montaigne, Milton, all included quite a deal of Lucretius in their work. And there is so much so that there is a book on Lucretius and English literature in the 60 years from 1680 to 1740. And that book is packed with references to Lucretius's poem by everybody who is anybody in English literature, because the people in the literary world then were not confined to late night TV channels talking out there to half a dozen sleepy people. They were involved in the whole discussion of society about philosophy, theology, science, politics. And this Epicurean poem is right through their literature, and it's in Shakespeare and everybody else. In the 18th century, David Hume wrote about Epicureanism and adopted the sceptic approach too. I've now found where Knudsen, the tutor, introduced his student Immanuel Kant to Lucretius's Epicurean atheist poem, and that converted Immanuel Kant from the Lutheran pietism of his upbringing to the deism of his mature writings. One of the most influential people was Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin. He was a Midlands doctor in his day who was known as a wonderful poet of nature, and his poetry of nature was based on Lucretius's poem. He had a huge influence on the Romantic movement literature, and there's a book just on that, Atheism in the Romantic Literature, which development. And his two grandsons, Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, took all their ideas from this same strain of evolution. And there's even, when you look back into it, David Sidley tracks it in the creationist debate in the antique times. There was a survival of the fittest doctrine going on then, and all sorts of other things. There's nothing original about them. So you know Charles Darwin, but you may not know of Francis Galton, equally grandson of Erasmus Darwin. So they were cousins. Francis Galton was the founder of Eugenics and social Darwinianism, which was the basis for the Nazis and many other things that went on. This is the big problem of there is no ought from is. You can apply this materialist view to any way you like. Thomas Jefferson, you'll hear about next time, labelled himself an Epicurean and a deist. He carried several copies of Lucretius's poem with him, and in his time in Europe he became a friend of the people who were involved with the conversion of the deist argument in England into critical liberal theology.
Sorry, and then just back to Edward Gibbon, Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, did you want to make any comment on that?
On which one, sorry?
Edward Gibbon, you didn't mention it.
No, the decline and fall of Rome, he was influenced by it, but it's not so obvious in his writings. But it set his atmosphere and his attitude to religion and such, but there aren't the specific quotes that you get in these others. Karl Marx. Some people say, well, his PhD thesis was irrelevant. Off the internet, I now have a copy of Karl Marx's PhD thesis, which is a comparison of the materialist naturalism of Democritus and Epicurus. So all of his atheist sociology, politics, anthropology and everything is based back there before Plato in that worldview of Democritus and Epicurus. Alfred North Whitehead, there's heaps of others involved, but I picked out Alfred North Whitehead because he was a mathematician who began process theology. And this comes out of his study of Lucretius and that poem. So in summary, there's the Greek world across 800 years before Christ, with more of the names in. You can see the alternation in generations between the different emphases across there. And early on it started as just differences of emphasis. What changes with these bold blue ones, the atomists, Epicurus and Lucretius, is their rabid anti-religionism. And that's what drove their writings, that's what drove their beliefs. And when that was rediscovered in the Renaissance by Poggio Bracciolini, this is what drove all the developments in the 17th and 18th century. Because by then, people could see that the gods in Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius were just irrelevant to everything. So if you strip them out, nothing changed, which is what they did. And the conclusion is that that's vastly too much for you to deal with. So I have copies here of that coloured mud map and you can have a copy of it which has the same colour code as what you see up there so that you can look at it and make some sense of it afterwards. And on the back of it is the list of all the names of the people that I put up there from the early church fathers in the first lot, 17th century, 18th century, then the 19th and 20th century. Thank you.
There's plenty of room over here, Peter. You don't need that one. You want to hide in the back stalls too?
I was going to, but...
Yeah, there's a couple of spare ones here. All right, I'll just kick off because I've got one question. Like with all this oscillating between people who are materialists or atheists and those who believed in the gods, it's interesting, but in a sense, and it's affected the history in the past. In a sense, so what? How does that affect us now and inform the way that we should act or behave?
I think one of the best guides to that is that book on creationism and its critics in Antiquity, where he goes through in detail the sorts of arguments that came up. And they were no slouches for thinkers back then. There's really nothing new going on now in what's argued about and for. And you can see the patterns that occur there. There's nothing new under the sun.
So you're saying it just gives us an opportunity to learn from the past so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? Or?
We just make our own new mistakes.
Oh.
But yes, there is a tremendous amount of detail there in those arguments. And I'm impressed with how much and how hard they thought about it all and argued cleverly about it all way back then. They can teach us how to construct arguments and how to think things through, and there's a completeness about some of their arguments that is fascinating. Even if you don't agree with them, you'll learn a lot from the way they argue.
Well, I found it fascinating that, in a sense, some of their physics, they got pretty close. Like atoms. There are atoms. And so I think it's quite remarkable that they were able to speculate and get fairly close to the truth and even be able to work out the circumference of the Earth. That's amazing.
Some of these questions, Kevin, there's only two choices. One person's right and one person's wrong to some extent. It's not really surprising that one of them got near being right.
The big problem is most of us are right about something and wrong about something else. And one of the things that you do learn looking at the history of philosophy, is that it's always far easier to criticise and destroy a position than to create one. Any argument or point that's put up, you just have to shift your base premises and you can demolish it. And that goes all the way through there.
I've loved reading some ancient texts I've come across. You mentioned a few of them tonight. And I've got amazing respect for the ancient art of rhetorical argument and for their philosophical ways of expressing themselves and the questions they come up with and answers they thought of. But in the end, those ancients have had to give away in our modern education because we don't have the assurance that some of them had that reasoning actually gets you to the truth any better than other methods. And in modern times we have the technologies and the rigours of modern science that we put more trust in getting to those rigours of the truth. And I think we have evidence that the ancient man would be he'd wish he had some of it. We can actually look at the structure of DNA, we can look at the structure of atoms, we can see a whole lot of stuff that they didn't see. And I've been amazed that in my own education I was totally ignorant of the science of information. Today a new branch of science is developing called information science. And it's been said by a lot of people who are aware of this new development that the most important thing about life is its dependence on information. And if someone wants to prove evolution true, they're going to have to show that real information can arise out of nothing. Whereas in our experience, we only ever find real information arising from a mind. And I find that puts the theist on top of the materialist very easily.
Which comes first, the mind or the design or the event, has been argued all through. Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion have a whole running argument about whether mind is first or body is first, and it's all there in the Greek world as well.
It's
the
there in
big
the
problem with
DNA world
science
too,
is that
though. It's there in the DNA world. In the DNA, you've got a code that obviously has meaning. We understand some of that now. And when that is translated across into the transfer RNA, little tRNA guys, there's another code used. It's translated from the DNA structure into the tRNA information. And on the ribosome, it's then translated again into the structure of a DNA molecule with the help of more machinery to fold it all up and so on. And the information is it appears to be put in at the DNA level. It has to transfer through the mechanical processes and come out in a particular shape of a protein, and those proteins become the building blocks of building machinery all over the living cell. So if an innovation is going to arrive by evolution, the evolutionist has to explain how the code gets into the DNA and it translates through to the ribosome and ends up in the shape of the molecule which fits with other molecules that build into machinery in the cell. So innovation requires that huge chain of information. It's not just one step of information, it's about 7 or probably 12. I've read a book that's very seriously proposing that there are 12 steps in that information chain.
I think we might be getting off the topic.
I think you're right.
It's not a topic,
It's a
but
great-
I think we're ahead of the
It's a great
ancients
argument
in
for
these
deism.
questions.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It's a great argument for deism, though. Not so much.
So
You're
what do you mean?
talking about mechanical detail, but the whole argument of design versus chance was all laid out there all through these 1,000 years and more.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
what you will get from that is some of the principles of proposing and arguing against a design argument,
Yeah.
because it is all there, and you simply would be applying it at a different level,
Yeah.
but the principles of the debate and the positions people held would be the same through all that history.
Does anybody take the modern atheist arguments and see how far that they've been found, argued before, I guess, and then argued against in the
The mechanical details change, but the philosophical principles are all there all the way through. And they argued it out very well.
We get to take Dawkins and hear his arguments, and this is where they were demolished.
This is what you'll get from there, and the feel of the people arguing for each side of the argument comes through in the analysis.
I think C.S. Lewis observed that each generation has its own arrogance on what has gone before. And we almost always have to believe that we know more than the previous generation and don't want to be told that the previous generation has discovered anything more and anything that is. I think that was a comment. I think it's a reasonable observation.
This always goes on because in the end of the 17th century, Newton and Leibniz had an enormous argument about who had invented calculus first.
Right.
There'd been rumours that Archimedes had invented calculus. And in 2001, a Greek Orthodox prayer book was found which had been made of vellum, and somebody realised it had been all scraped off and cut and restitched. And so they put it through a scanning process in Princeton University, which is set up for analysing these documents. And there was Archimedes' invention of calculus and his application of it to more things than Newton and Leibniz combined
Okay.
2,000 years earlier.
Yes, thank you.
The more you look at what they did there, the more we're arrogant to say we know more than them. We might know a few more mechanical bits more than them, but our thinking processes are no better.
We know
And
more
often-
intelligent than they are.
Sorry?
We're no more intelligent than they are.
No.
No.
And
But we
they-
do know a lot more about it. I mean, we've
Yeah.
landed on the moon and fixed up our...
Oh, mechanical stuff, yes.
Yeah,
We know an
collected-
enormous amount of it.
I can give another illustration of what you just said. In elementary calculus, you can uncover a simple rule for finding the square root of a number, and it's a process you can work through and it gets more and more accurate. And a lot of people would think that calculus discovered that principle, but in fact this very algorithm was used long before calculus was discovered to do exactly the same thing and get exactly the same numbers.
One of the things that Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris and co have in their arsenal that was missing from the ancient world was obviously Darwin's theories. Can you?
No,
No?
it's all there.
Really?
Selection of the fittest and all the rest of it is way back there.
Used in the same way as what? Because it seems to undergird a whole science versus religion debate. But you're saying that turns up in the ancient
It's
world?
way back there. I
It
did
does.
three.
It
Who in
looks like a
particular?
modern argument.
Now, it was surprisingly early in the debates with...
I thought you had some.
You mentioned something about
Yeah.
the slime or something.
Yes,
I can
but
track
the
it down.
particular argument which produced the process of selection of survival of the fittest, I can't put a name on that one at the moment, but it was back there, at least before 300 BC.
In fact, you even quoted that Erasmus Darwin read all of that, and therefore possibly even...
Well,
Darwin's grandfather.
Erasmus Darwin read Lucretius's poem and based his nature poetry on that, which has its own theory of evolution and other things in there. And he was accused of being an Epicurean poet. Charles Darwin said he didn't get his ideas from his grandfather, but really he got them all from the same source as his grandfather. He was born after his grandfather died.
So
My understanding about evolution is that what Charles Darwin really contributed was evidence for evolution by natural selection, both the natural selection and the evidence that he was able to provide. He spent 20 years working on the evidence and getting that in his book organised. And so people did talk about evolution before, but Charles had the evidence and set it out in such a way that for most people of that day, it was irrefutable that evolution had taken place. The other thing that he did was he saw the connection where people were able, for example, to breed up pigeons and dogs, and they were quite different from their parents and all this sort of business. So that evolution had taken place even then. But people selected which breeds, what dogs they're going to breed together to get particular bits and pieces. Whereas Charles Darwin, as I understand, his breakthrough was that he saw that you don't need people to do it. Nature itself will select which one's going to reproduce by killing off the ones that don't.
That's all there back in the ancients.
Well,
yeah, you're just saying that Darwin's contribution was he actually formally collected evidence to support
he
it.
collected the evidence and he came
They
up
could see
with
variation
natural
back then, and they
selection.
could see selection and the processes.
Natural
But
selection.
they had all of this going then.
Is there a difference though
Just-
now in the weight of evidence, because we've got whole genetic evidence and the whole, a whole lot of
Genome.
let me say evidence, and it's no longer, a lot of it is no longer debated. I'll be careful with how I phrase it. But has that changed the debate between Dawkins and somebody in the ancient times?
Not really, it's just the way you choose to see the evidence, but they're aware of all of that variation and selection process, and they posited all of this. It's a load of mechanical detail.